Hey guys, I'm your comic educator. I know it's been a little while. This is my first videos that I've produced, and I want to say about a year. But I am back. I'm going to try to produce a couple more videos here and there. It probably be about once a week. I am very busy, unfortunately, right now, trying to situate my home situation and trying to get established a little better there. Um, but today I'm going to be discussing a couple of different kind of horror comics and just the influence those comics had on the horror subgenre as a whole, and just the topic matter that each of these kind of horror comics kind of touch upon. So the first one I'd like to discuss is called American Vampire. It's made by the DC Black Label imprint, which I find really interesting. That's the imprint in DC that kind of covers more of the darker aspects of the DC universe. I believe the books involving Constantine and Sandman are all part of that Black Label. Um, it's an interesting imprint, and American Vampire itself is a little more of an anthology series. It doesn't take place in one time period. It kind of touches upon the evolution of the vampires as a species throughout kind of history. Obviously, kind of dealing mainly with American history. Now, a very interesting aspect is the fact that it was created by the writer Scott Snyder, um, and the first like 5 issues were a grouping of two stories that were written by Snyder himself, but actually the second author on the book itself was Stephen King himself, who kind of helped with that second story. Snyder covering the first part, King covering the second. To kind of quickly touch upon the stories that are within the book, um, the first story that you kind of cover and follow along is the character of Pearl, who I believe it's in 1925 that she was an aspiring actress. And basically, you kind of open the book with her being thrown onto this pile of bodies, with her kind of weakly stating that she's still alive as she's being placed upon this pile. And it flashes back to 3 days before, where you find out that her and a friend of hers were invited to this party by basically a producer, and that when they went to this party, that something had happened. They don't specify within, especially the first comic, what happened. They kind of leave it with her being thrown upon this pile of bodies, and they open up back into the next comic with her kind of wandering the desert and being found by her friends, and them kind of basically saying that she's very kind of weak and almost on the verge of death from blood loss and the amount of animal bites that are all over her body. At this point, Pearl's on the verge of death when her friend and one of these random strangers from the party the night before, that we end up knowing as Skinner Sweet, ends up basically climbing into the hospital window. As she's on the verge of death, we found out that Skinner Sweet kind of bites his own lip, and in the process gives her some of his blood through the process of a kiss. And it's kind of interesting because at this point she does die, but later on, moments later, when she's transported to the morgue, she then kind of wakes up in the morgue, surrounded by dead bodies. I do want to point out that there is a little Easter egg here, where the one of the bodies is named Jack Torrance. I'm assuming that that would be a reference to Jack from The Shining. I have a very strong suspicion that this in particular issue was written by King himself. As you guys can tell, just from a little bit I told you about, like the first and second issues, it's a really interesting kind of comic. And this series started off as just two kind of mini stories within the series, each comic kind of going back and forth, basically being one part of one story, the next being a part of the other, until they finished both. And the popularity of the American Vampire series was popular enough that it actually ended up spinning off into a couple of miniseries where they touch upon this aspect of vampires that you really don't hear about. Like, for the most part, it's very cut and kind of dried as far as vampires go. And in this one, they kind of touch upon the fact that over time and evolution, that just like animals and people kind of evolve, that the vampires themselves have evolved. And I don't know too much about the series. I will tell you this honestly, reading just a little bit and kind of doing the research for this in particular comic has made me want to know more, especially the aspect of being empowered by daylight instead of having that as a weakness. And curious if there's any other kind of clans or subspecies of vampire that are either weak to different things that we're not used to, or again are empowered by those weaknesses instead of having them used against them. So alright guys, so that's my review on American Vampire. I'm going to do a couple more videos today, individual comics that are horror based, and do a quick kind of review and kind of synopsis of each of the comics in my opinion, and like I said before, kind of how they influence or the horror subgenre, and kind of how it branches out a little bit, kind of like I was talking about earlier with American Vampire, kind of touching upon the different weaknesses and the evolution of the vampires over time. So I will see you guys later today. I hope you watch those videos too, and that you're having an amazing day, and I hope that you guys like and subscribe.